It is now in order to consider amendment number 24, printed in House Report 112-485. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 24, printed in House Report number 112-485, offered by Mr. Wittman of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 661, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wittman, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I might consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all know the record of problems at Arlington National Cemetery, and we know the current leadership there has made significant progress in fixing that system. But my concern with Arlington is not with the professionals and leaders who have turned Arlington around and worked tirelessly to ensure the fallen members of our all-volunteer force, our veterans and their families, are treated with the respect, reverence, and honor they deserve. My concern is that the scandals and embarrassment that rocked Arlington National Cemetery went largely unprosecuted for one reason. No one of the former civilian directors in the former chain of command at Arlington was held accountable for their actions and their gross negligence and mismanagement, because none of them were subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Additionally, Arlington is managed by the Army and rests adjacent to a joint military base. Tenants of that command work on that base daily. With that, I believe strongly that we need to have a military leader now in charge of Arlington National Cemetery. Mr. Chairman, with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from Florida. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
I rise to reluctantly oppose the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself such time as I might consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
On the 10th of June of 2010, the Secretary of the Army, former member of this body, John McHugh, appointed Catherine Condon, a former high-ranking senior civilian Army official with a strong management background, as the first executive director of the Army National Cemeteries program. There is every indication that she is qualified and well-suited for the post. The Army created the new position to oversee Arlington's National Cemetery and Soldiers' Home National Cemetery as a result of the problems that's been discussed by my friend and colleague, Mr. Wittman. In its initial recommendations, the Army did not state that the newly created executive director position should be filled by a military official, and since that time has not provided any rationale stating why a military official would be better suited for this position rather than a civilian with credentials like Ms. Condon. This amendment would establish the military chain of command, requiring the executive director of the Army cemetery programs be a commissioned officer, replacing the current civilian in that position. Army oversight over the cemetery program remains very strong by virtue of the fact that Ms. Condon reports directly to the Secretary of the Army. There is every indication today that Ms. Condon has performed her duties in a competent and effective manner. All IG and advisory committee reports show that significant progress at Arlington has been made under her leadership. Ms. Condon's status as a civilian does not affect the overall authority of the Army over the program or any aspect of the operations under her care. I note that the Secretary of the Army, Secretary McHugh, wrote a strong letter of opposition to this amendment for the reasons that I've just addressed, and I would urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. West.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also, Chairman Wittman. And I do rise to support this amendment. Having spent time in the military, we were taught that there were some basic principles, and a couple of those basic principles are unity of command and unity of effort. I would take nothing away from the civilian appointee that we have in this position currently, but as we said, this is the Army National Cemetery. And it being the Army National Cemetery, I feel that it is very important that we have a chain of command, a chain of leadership that could fall under the Military District of Washington. As a matter of fact, the Sergeant Major of the Military District of Washington is someone that I served with at Fort Bragg, North Carolina when I was a young major. And we understand chain of command. We understand responsibility and accountability. And I talked to him about this, and he feels that that would be something that would be very well appropriate for to have a military commissioned officer. When you look at our arsenals, our arsenals out there have strong civilian leadership and also strong civilian employees, but yet we have a military commander. When you look at an organization such as the Army Material Command, which is some 60 to 70% civilian, but yet we have a 4-star general, General Ann Dunwoody, who's someone that I also know very well and serve with, is in charge of that organization. So I think if we want to make sure that we have the right type of unity of command, unity of effort, chain of command in place, we need to make sure that we have a uniformed military person that's in control of this and in command of this Army National Cemetery. Thank you, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to my distinguished colleague from the state of California, Mr. Hunter.
The gentleman from California is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the gentleman from Virginia and the gentleman from Florida. I'd like to start by talking about what this means to me. This is about accountability, responsibility, and authority. All of these leadership themes are well defined throughout the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But a civilian team does not protect the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. That's the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment that has the responsibility to honor our fallen comrades and conduct ceremonies and special events to represent the U.S. Army. One of the most known tasks of this unit is the distinguished charge of guarding the tomb of the unknown at Arlington National Cemetery, which it has done with honor since July of 1937. Again, this is a military unit. It's not a civilian unit. Many of our fallen heroes who were killed in action choose to be buried in Arlington. Home to our nation's military history, the men and women who sacrificed to make this country what it is today. The current chain of command under the Department of the Army has the civilian executive director of the Army National Cemeteries reporting directly to the Secretary of the Army. Nowhere in the current chain of command does there exist a uniformed military officer of appropriate rank with commensurate command authority, accountability, and responsibility who is subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If we are only going to have one major national cemetery that is run by a branch of the DOD, then there needs to be a uniform chain of command that runs the cemetery in a professional military manner. And in closing, I would state, Mr. Chairman, I have friends that may choose to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and I would urge adoption of this amendment.
What purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
I would like to ask the sponsor of the amendment if he has any more speakers.
I do. I'm going to have myself as the last.
You will close.
Yes, I will close.
And he has the right to close.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
With that, then I would yield back the balance of my time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with that, thank you. As you've heard, this issue is really about this. It's about making sure that there's accountability and that there's responsibility at this nation's most distinguished resting place, where our heroes that have defended this nation go for their final resting place. If we put a uniformed officer in command of Arlington National Cemetery, then that officer will be held accountable to the exact same standards as the heroes buried at Arlington once were. That is the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The men and women of our all-volunteer force who fall in combat and those who serve and who choose to be buried at Arlington deserve the honor of having a uniformed commanding officer to watch over them as they rest, to set and enforce a standard of military excellence and commitment, honor and integrity that only those serving in uniform can fully comprehend. Folks, these are our nation's heroes. We owe them nothing less, especially in light of the problems that we've had there at Arlington. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to put back in place the distinction and the honor deserved by our men and women that have so honorably served this nation.
Time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.